Elias Rourke's cabin sat in a hollow of pine and snow the color of bone. The fur trap line had brought him into the country when the days still stretched long enough to pretend the world was endless. Now the winter had tightened like a fist. Wind came from the ridge in hard breaths that flung powder sideways, and the drifts stacked themselves at the door until the latch looked like a buried thing. Inside, the air tasted of smoke, tallow, and old coffee grounds. The walls were stitched with soot where Elias had burned fat lamps through storms. He kept the stove going because dying was easier than staying awake, and because the cold had a way of turning thoughts mean. The nights were long enough that guilt could crawl into his chest and sit there, quiet and patient. Elias had told himself he was done running from what he'd done, that the trap line was work, not punishment, that the years since had laid down a kind of dirt over the old grave he carried. But the land remembered. The wind remembered. The stories traveled even when a man tried to keep them still. On the third day of deep freeze, when the snow fell thick and silent, a sound came from outside that didn't belong to weather. It was not the scrape of a branch or the groan of timber. It was a dragging footfall, careful at first and then not careful at all, like someone had started out planning to survive and ended up bargaining with fate. Elias stood with his axe in hand before he realized he'd moved. His knees cracked. His breath came in sharp bursts. The cabin's small window, frosted over, made the night beyond look like blank paper. He listened again, holding still enough to hear his own heartbeat. Then came a thin rasp, human, too close to be imagined, and the sound of something wet striking wood. Elias moved to the door, pushed aside a curtain of hanging hides, and cracked the latch. Cold punched in immediately, white and brutal, but so did the scent of blood mixed with the sharp tang of pine pitch on wool. A woman lay half-turned in the drift, like she'd been set down by hands that didn't care what came next. Her face was pale under grime, her lashes clumped with ice. A shawl had slipped from her shoulders, exposing a strip of hair and a bit of beaded leather at her collarbone. One arm was folded under her as if she had tried to shield herself and then ran out of strength. Elias stared, the axe still raised. The woman's lips moved. No words came at first, just breath that sounded like it might be the last of itself. He'd spent his life learning to read tracks, to tell a man's purpose by the way he walked. This wasn't a wandering drifter. This was a person being hunted by something, or by someone, and then by winter. His throat tightened. "Hey," he said, and his voice came out rough, not steady. "You're hurt. Can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered. They were dark, too dark for the pale face, eyes that held color even when the world went white. For a moment, Elias thought she looked past him, as if she saw a different cabin door. Then she tried to lift her head and failed. "Elias," she rasped, each syllable dragged like a stone across ice. Elias felt something in his ribs shift. The name in her mouth was wrong, or maybe it was right in a way he couldn't bear. He crouched in the doorway and reached for her shoulder. Her skin was cold enough to shock his palm. He swore under his breath because the human body wasn't built to survive like this. "Come on," he said. "I'm getting you in." It wasn't bravery that moved him, it was a kind of stubborn refusal. If the world wanted to steal this woman, it would have to do it after Elias had tried. He hauled her inside, half expecting her to be a corpse with warmth left only in memory. But she shuddered when the cabin's heat hit her, and the movement was living. He stripped away the wet layers with careful hands, though his fingers trembled. A wool wrap came off first, then a thin blanket. Underneath, her clothes were patched and improvised, beaded along the edge with patterns that Elias had seen before in trader stories, and in the way some men refused to look too long at certain faces. He recognized beads the way he recognized trap wire, something made with intention, not randomness. He found the wound after he got her positioned near the stove. It was deep enough that the edges looked black in the firelight. Blood had frozen and then thawed and then frozen again, turning her skin around it into something torn between worlds. Elias fetched clean cloth from a tin box, heated water, and laid a strip of it along the cut. He worked with the grim efficiency of someone who'd stitched his own hands after falls and had once mended a neighbor's leg after a bear trap went off wrong. The woman's breath came in ragged bursts. She tried to speak again.
"You didn't come,"
she whispered. Elias leaned closer, his jaw clenched. "I don't know you." Her eyelids fluttered, and the look that crossed her face wasn't confusion. It was grief with anger braided into it. "You do," she said, and then coughed hard enough to make her entire body jolt. "You told me. You promised to bring them." Elias's mind snagged on the word them. He thought of the people he'd left behind years ago, the ones whose names he'd learned and then tried to stop hearing in his sleep. He stood suddenly, swaying with the sudden rush of blood to his head. "Who are you?" For a moment she seemed to consider lying. Her eyes flicked toward the window, toward the blank wall of snow, toward the kind of danger you couldn't shoot. Then she lifted her chin as if she could force strength through sheer will. "I am Delphine Tazii," she said. The name struck Elias like a thrown stone, not because it belonged to a book or a preacher's record, but because it belonged to a scarred story told in half sentences around a fire. Delphine Tazii, an Apache woman whose family had been scattered, whose people had been driven into the margins by men with rifles and permits. Elias had heard she was dead. He swallowed. "That's not possible." Delphine's lips curved with something that wasn't a smile. "You buried my name." Elias went cold despite the stove. The cabin's heat suddenly felt like a lie. He had buried something all right. He'd found a bundle of clothing on a trail where bodies had been stripped by weather and scavengers. He'd heard the shape of a name from the trader's mouth, heard it and then let it harden into an ending. He'd worn that ending like armor. Now the ending sat in his chair by the stove and looked at him like he was the one who'd broken. "Why are you here?" he asked, even as he already knew the question was cruel. The answer would be hunger and fear, and the kind of desperation that made people become less than themselves. Delphine shifted, grimacing. Elias pulled back the cloth, inspected the wound again. The stitching would have to come later. First, there was only the stop the blood, the keeper from slipping away. "I was traveling," Delphine said, the words slow, tested. "I was told you were a man with a cabin, a man who keeps to his promises." Elias let out a bitter breath. "Promises? I don't know what you think you know." Delphine's gaze sharpened. "You think you don't?" Elias stared at her a long moment, searching her face the way he searched a ridge for game. Her eyes held the same kind of alertness he'd seen in people who grew up knowing the land could kill you without warning. He didn't like how his body responded to her. He didn't like the way his heart tightened when her voice grew weaker. He didn't like the way guilt, hot and familiar, began to burn again. Outside, the wind hit the cabin harder, shoving sound into the seams. A tree branch snapped in the distance, a clean fracture that made Elias think of ribs breaking. He moved Delphine closer to the stove. "You're safe for now," he said, knowing he couldn't promise more than time. Delphine watched him, and in her expression there was calculation, not coldness, survival. The kind of awareness that didn't let you hand your life to strangers. "You're not alone," she said. Elias blinked. "What do you mean?" Her eyes flicked toward the corner where his rifle leaned against the wall. "I heard another man." Elias's spine stiffened. The cabin had been quiet. That didn't mean it had been empty. Before he could reach for the rifle, the door groaned under another hit of wind. Elias stepped toward it, palm already on the latch. A shadow moved beyond the frosted glass, the shape of a hat brim. A hand raised as if to knock. Then, from the other side, a voice called in a lazy drawl. "Elias, you in there?" Elias froze. He recognized the voice. Hollis Crane, trapper, bully, and the kind of man who could smile while he took something. Delphine's head turned sharply toward Elias. Her eyes widened a fraction, and Elias saw the truth in it. She knew Hollis, too. "I told you," she whispered. "He's not far." Elias tightened his grip on the latch. "How'd you find me?" he demanded. Hollis's voice came again, closer. "Trail tells. Tracks tell. Men like you don't hide worth a damn." Then Hollis laughed, and the sound turned bitter in Elias's ears. "Now open up before you freeze solid and we both waste good meat on the birds." Elias stepped back from the door, looking at Delphine. The wound needed heat and quiet. Hollis needed entry. "Stay under the blanket," Elias said. Delphine shook her head slightly. "No, he comes for you, or for what you keep." Elias's jaw clenched. Hollis had always wanted Elias's best furs, his roots, his traps. Hollis didn't just steal, he claimed. He'd taken supplies from starving men in the name of fair trade. Elias reached for the rifle anyway, then reconsidered. If he fired, he might buy seconds and lose Delphine's safety. The door latch clicked when he opened it a crack. Wind slapped in like a living thing. Hollis stood there in a thick coat, cheeks red from cold, eyes bright with an animal hunger. He took one look at Elias and then looked past him into the cabin. Hollis's gaze snagged on Delphine near the stove. His mouth opened slightly, and for a moment, the bully in him faltered. "That's a fine prize," he said. Delphine's hand moved under the blanket like she reached for something invisible. Elias saw the tension in her shoulders. Hollis's eyes gleamed. "You said no one was coming. You always lonely, Elias?" Elias stepped into the doorway, blocking Hollis from seeing more. "Get off my land." Hollis chuckled. "Your land, sure. That's what you tell yourself." Delphine's face hardened. She didn't speak, but her silence was a threat. Hollis leaned forward, voice dropping like a blade. "I heard what happened to Apache women. I heard what men did with what they found. You got yourself one that ain't dead, huh?" Elias's body moved before his thoughts caught up. He seized Hollis by the front of his coat and slammed him back out of the doorway. Hollis stumbled into the snow with a curse. Elias pulled the door shut and latched it tight. The latch groaned under the effort of wind, but Elias forced it closed. Delphine watched him, breathing shallow and shaky. "You think you can hide me from him?" she said. Elias turned, his face hot. "I can keep you alive." Delphine's eyes narrowed. "Alive is not the same as free." Elias didn't answer. The stove hissed. The cabin creaked. Outside, Hollis knocked once, then twice, as if he expected the world to obey him. Delphine gripped the blanket edge. Her voice softened, but the words cut deeper. "He came for you, Elias." "Not for me at first." Elias swallowed hard. "I don't know why he's here." Delphine's gaze turned inward, as if she saw a memory through the smoke. "Because he thinks you're someone else." Elias felt the air shift. "What are you saying?" Delphine looked at him then, and in her eyes Elias saw the conflict that lived behind her ribs. She wanted to explain, but she couldn't afford to. "He thinks you're the man who brought rifles to the valley," she said. "He thinks you betrayed my people." Elias's blood went hot. "That's not me." Delphine's breath hitched. "But you wear the same kind of guilt." Elias backed away, bumping a chair. "I was told—" "I know what you were told," Delphine interrupted. Her voice cracked, and for the first time Elias heard fear in it, not for herself, but for the story she might have to relive. The truth came to Elias in a way that didn't feel like understanding. It felt like being cornered. He had been a young trapper, hungry for money and safety. A trader had offered him a route, promised him payment, and warned him that certain men should not be questioned. Elias had accepted. Later, someone had said he'd been seen near the valley when Apache families were moved and rifles appeared like magic. Elias hadn't carried rifles into that place. He'd been there, but not the way they claimed. He'd been there to find a lost set of traps. He'd been there to rescue a boy who'd wandered too close. But the boy was dead. The rifles were gone. The story remained. Now Delphine held that story in her eyes as if it were an ember. Outside, Hollis's voice rose through the wind. "Elias, open up! I know you got company!" Elias didn't move. He felt the need to open the door and end it. He felt the need to do nothing. He looked at Delphine. Her wound was still bleeding under the cloth, though slower. Her skin had begun to warm, but her posture stayed rigid, as if warmth could be taken away at any moment. Elias made a decision shaped like desperation. He fetched a second blanket and laid it over Delphine as if clothing could disguise her. He moved his rifle to a more accessible spot. Then he pulled a small kettle down from a shelf. "You're going to drink," he said. Delphine's brows lifted. "From your hand?" Elias gave a humorless laugh. "From the kettle. I'm not feeding you like a child." Delphine accepted the cup when he held it out. Her fingers were cracked at the knuckles, nails stained with soot and winter grime. Elias noticed a beadwork cord around her wrist, frayed but intact. "You keep that," he said before he could stop himself. Delphine's gaze dropped to the cord. "It's a promise," she said. Elias stared at her. "And mine?" Delphine lifted her eyes. "Your promise is in the grave you made. That's what you've done. You buried my name." Elias felt his stomach twist. "I didn't—" "You did," Delphine said, and the words were steady now, which made them worse. "You didn't understand what you were doing, but you did it." She coughed again, pressing her hand to her ribs. Elias rose, alarmed. Hollis slammed something into the door. The wood shuddered. "Elias, I'm done knocking!" Elias had hoped the cold might hold Hollis at bay, but winter didn't stop a man determined to get what he wanted. Winter only made men more honest about what they would do. Elias moved faster. He forced water to boil harder. He stitched Delphine's wound with thread he'd saved for trap repairs, using a needle he sanitized with boiled cloth. Delphine watched him, jaw clenched. Her eyes didn't drift. She didn't look away from the pain. When the needle pinched, she hissed. When Elias's hand steadied, her breath eased. "You're not the man I expected," she said. Elias's throat tightened. "And you're not who I thought I buried." Delphine gave a slow blink. "Who did you bury?" Elias's mind flickered to the trader's words, stories that had turned into certainty. He didn't want to say it. Names were heavy. Names carried blame. But Delphine deserved truth, or at least the kind of honesty that wasn't built on cowardice. He exhaled. "A woman my trader called Delphine, Apache. She was found on a trail. I was told she'd been left to die." Delphine stared at him as if she'd been struck. For a heartbeat, her face looked younger, unguarded, like grief could pull the years away. "She didn't make it far," Delphine whispered. "But she didn't leave her name behind. She left it in someone else." Elias frowned. "In someone else?" Delphine's fingers tightened around the blanket. "In me." Elias felt relief and rage at once. Relief that she lived. Rage that the world had stolen her and then tried to claim it hadn't. He heard himself ask, "What happened to the rest of your people?" Delphine's eyes went distant. "They scattered. They survived. They lost their homes and their maps. And men like Hollis—" She didn't finish, but Elias knew the rest. Hollis's kind didn't just take things. They took choice. They took the shape of the future. Hollis, through the door, kept shouting. The wind carried his anger like smoke. Elias stepped to the window and peered through the frosted glass. The snow whipped thick. Hollis had settled near the cabin's outer wall now, using the storm like cover. He moved his hands like he worked at something, maybe a tool, maybe a plan. Delphine followed his gaze. "He's waiting," she said. "For what?" Elias asked. Delphine's voice dropped. "For you to get tired of pretending you're alone." Elias looked back at her. "I'm not pretending." Delphine's eyes held his. "Then prove it." Elias didn't understand the demand until the next moment. He heard a click, small, sharp, followed by the groan of wood as the outside latch shifted. Hollis had found a weak spot. He'd brought a tool. He was going to get in. Elias's instinct screamed to fight. His conscience screamed to protect Delphine. He moved her toward the back of the cabin where the floorboards were loose. He'd found that spot years ago and repaired it only partially because he'd always believed he might need a hiding place someday. Delphine hesitated only once. Elias's voice softened despite himself. "Stay quiet." Delphine's eyes flared. "Quiet won't save you." Elias swallowed. "It might save you." Delphine's stare said she hated that truth. Hollis forced the door with one shoulder, the wood cracking under strain. The latch finally gave. Cold rushed in with him like a second attacker. Elias stepped into the breach holding his rifle across his chest. Hollis raised his hands slowly, mock surprised. "Ah," Hollis said, smile crooked. "So you were alone. You was just sheltering a ghost." Elias's eyes stayed on Hollis. "Where you been sleeping, Hollis?" he asked. Hollis laughed. "Sleep? I never sleeps. I take from the world what the world gives me." Elias's finger tightened slightly on the trigger. He didn't want to shoot. Shooting ended things too quickly. He wanted Hollis to stop before something permanent happened. Hollis's gaze shifted past Elias to where the stove threw light on the floor. "That smell," he said. "Medicine." Elias didn't move. "Go on out." Hollis's eyes sharpened. "You think you can tell me what to do?" Elias answered with his rifle lifted a fraction. "I can tell you to leave. The decision's yours." Hollis's smile widened. "Or what? You'll kill me? You're no killer, Elias. I've been watching you." Elias's stomach dropped. "Watching?" Hollis stepped inside, boots scraping. "People talk. People point. They say you was the one with the rifles and the scouts. They say you betrayed Apache families and then acted like it was the storm's fault." Elias felt his heart beat harder. "Who told you that?" Hollis's expression turned satisfied. "It don't matter. It's true enough to bleed." Elias's mind flared back to that valley, men with rifles, the confusion, the boy's face as he died too close to Elias's hands. He had wanted vengeance against the unknown version of himself. Now Hollis was offering him a target. Elias's voice came out low. "You don't know me." Hollis leaned forward, eyes gleaming with contempt. "I know you got a cabin and a soft spot for women." Elias's anger rose, hot and sharp. "That ain't softness." Hollis laughed again. "Sure, keep calling it that." He reached out as if to grab Elias's coat. Elias swatted his hand away and moved his rifle butt into Hollis's chest. Hollis staggered back, surprising himself with the impact. Hollis recovered fast. He lunged. The two men collided near the stove. Heat hit Elias's face, and in the fight, Hollis knocked the medicine cloth aside. Elias's heart punched against his ribs as the sound of Delphine's hiding place, beneath the floorboards, threatened to become exposed. Elias shoved Hollis hard. Hollis hit the wall with a grunt and then surged back. They grappled, banging into chair legs and beams. The cabin's smallness made every movement dangerous. A gunshot would have turned the entire place into shrapnel. Hollis grabbed Elias's rifle, trying to pull it away. Elias drove his elbow into Hollis's jaw. Pain shot through Elias's arm, but Hollis's head snapped sideways. Hollis staggered. For a second, his eyes lost their gleam. Then he smiled anyway. "You think you're saving someone," he rasped, "but you're just letting her die in another way." Elias stared at him, breath ragged. Hollis's gaze slid toward the back of the cabin again. He knew. Delphine's presence wasn't guessed, it was bait. Hollis had come because he expected to find her. Elias felt a sick turn. Someone had told Hollis about Delphine, about an Apache woman surviving, about her being worth more alive than dead. Hollis spat blood onto the floor. "She's worth a lot, Elias." Elias's voice went quiet. "Then you'll never collect." He moved toward Hollis slowly, keeping his body between Hollis and the hiding place. Hollis reached for something on the floor, an iron pry tool Elias kept for repairs. He brought it up in a swing. Elias caught the tool with his forearm. The metal cut, pain flaring bright. He drove his palm into Hollis's shoulder, forcing him back. Hollis stumbled toward the cabin's narrow passage, and in the struggle, the floorboard Elias had nearly repaired groaned. Delphine beneath the boards would have to shift to breathe. Elias's mind sharpened around one thought. The moment the floor shifted, Delphine would be seen. He couldn't let that happen. Elias lunged forward with ferocity born from fear. He struck Hollis again, this time harder, aiming for the side of the head where Elias knew old fractures lived. Hollis went down hard. The pry tool clattered. Elias didn't stop moving. He grabbed the rope and tied Hollis's wrists quickly, tight enough to keep him from reaching for a knife. Hollis's eyes rolled, then focused again. He looked at Elias with hatred that didn't need a full body to survive. "You're making a fool's bed, Elias," Hollis muttered. "You won't be able to pay the price." Elias didn't respond. His hands shook, and he hated that weakness more than he hated pain. He knelt at the loose floorboard and lifted it carefully. Cold breath rose from below, and Delphine's face appeared in the dim light. She blinked, stunned, as if she hadn't believed rescue would come. Then relief crossed her face, quick and fierce, and replaced by sharp suspicion. "You let him in," she said. Elias's throat tightened. "He broke in." Delphine's gaze flicked to Hollis, bound on the floor. "And you fought him." Elias nodded once. Delphine stared at him, and Elias felt the weight of her appraisal. She seemed to be deciding if his effort meant truth or if it was another kind of lie. "Who is he to you?" she asked. Elias swallowed. "Trouble." Delphine's eyes narrowed. "No, who is he to you?" Elias looked away because the honest answer was worse. Hollis wasn't just trouble. Hollis was the kind of man who had built his living on other people's fear. If Hollis had come for Delphine, then someone wanted Delphine as property, not as a person. Elias finally said, "He thinks I betrayed your people. He thinks I'm a man I'm not." Delphine's expression shifted, and Elias saw surprise bloom into grief. "Then he was told wrong." Elias looked back at her. "Or he's using wrong as an excuse." Delphine nodded slowly. "Both." A heavy silence filled the cabin. The stove popped and hissed. The wind pressed against the door like a hand searching for a crack. Delphine climbed out from beneath the floorboard, slow and careful. Elias steadied her without touching too much. Touch mattered. It could become claim. Delphine leaned toward him anyway, not for permission, but because her body was still recovering. Elias helped her back toward the stove. He pulled a clean cloth and rechecked her stitched wound. "How long were you out there?" he asked. Delphine's eyes held his. "Long enough to hear the cabin before I saw it." Elias exhaled. "That makes no sense." Delphine's gaze turned distant. "It does if you know the trail. It does if you know what sound carries in snow." Elias didn't argue. The more he learned, the more he realized he'd been ignorant of truths that existed right under his nose. He looked at Delphine's face and noticed the bruising around her wrists. Thin bruises like rope had been tight. Not severe enough to kill, but enough to say what had been done. His anger flared again. "They tied you," he said. Delphine's jaw tightened. "Men with badges, men with papers, men who say they protect the law when they're only protecting themselves." Elias's stomach churned. "Sheriff?" Delphine shook her head slowly. "Not sheriff, another." She wouldn't name the man. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe she feared the name would summon him. Elias stared at the bound Hollis now, thinking. Hollis had come with confidence. Confidence meant information. If someone had sold Hollis a story, it might also have sold the town a lie. Elias felt a terrible realization. Delphine didn't just think Elias was someone else. Elias thought she was dead. Hollis thought Elias was a betrayer. All three of them were trapped inside misunderstandings, and misunderstandings were how people died. Delphine's eyelids fluttered. "Your cabin is too small," she murmured. Elias nodded. "Winter don't care. It makes even men with land into prisoners." Delphine looked up at him. "Do you know what I thought when you opened the door?" Elias swallowed. What? Delphine's expression softened just a fraction. I thought you were the man who wouldn't let me die. I thought you were the man who buried my name and then regretted it. I thought the storm had brought you to me. Elias's throat tightened with something like tenderness he didn't want to admit. You thought I'd come back. Delphine nodded. But you were kind. In a way, men aren't supposed to be kind to Apache women. Elias flinched at the words, supposed. Delphine continued, voice low. That kindness made me scared. Elias stared at her. Why? Delphine looked down at her hands. Because kindness is how a man decides he's the hero, and heroes don't always ask what you want. Elias's chest hurt. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, but he didn't have the right to be certain. Outside, Hollis shifted, muttering curses that echoed. Elias stood, keeping his movements controlled. He crossed to Hollis and stared down at him. I'm going to cut you loose when the storm eases, Elias said. Hollis laughed, swollen cheek pulling. You'll cut me loose? After what I've been through? After I come all this way? Elias's voice went cold. After I decide what kind of man I'm going to be. Delphine watched from the stove area. Her gaze wasn't fearful now, it was assessing. Elias turned his head slightly toward her. He's not your enemy? He asked. Delphine's brows lifted. He's my enemy if he touches me again. Elias nodded. Then we'll see if he wants to live long enough to learn what that means. Hollis's smile faded. Something like fear flickered. Elias had the look of a man who didn't enjoy violence but would use it anyway. He finished untying one knot, but not enough to free Hollis fully. You stay where you are, Elias ordered. Then he returned to Delphine. Delphine's voice came quieter now. Elias, he paused. What? Delphine's eyes held his with a desperate honesty. Do you know my language? Elias shook his head. No. Delphine's mouth tightened. Then how did you know what to answer? How did you know my name? Elias stared at her confused. I didn't. Delphine's gaze sharpened. But you did when I said it. Your face changed. Elias's throat tightened. He thought of the traitor's story, the way it had lodged in him like splinters. He said slowly, I heard your name. Years back. I was told you were dead. Delphine's eyes glistened, and Elias hated the way his heart responded to the vulnerability. He didn't want to be the cause of tears. He wanted to be the end of them. I'm alive, Delphine said, but I'm not the only one who isn't. Elias frowned. What do you mean? Delphine inhaled sharply. You called yourself a trapper. You called your guilt a job. But someone else in this cabin thinks he's the one you've been all along. Elias didn't understand until Delphine looked toward Hollis again. He thinks you betrayed us, Delphine said. So he will bring more men. He will bring papers and rifles. He will bring stories that make violence feel like justice. Elias's stomach sank. So you're saying we don't just survive the storm? Delphine's voice was a whisper. We survived the lie. Elias's mind churned. How do you fight a lie that people need to believe? How do you prove your innocence when the only witnesses were dead or scattered? He remembered the boy he'd tried to save. Remembered the boy's name in a language Elias didn't speak. Remembered a mark on the boy's wrist, a beadwork cord with a notch pattern. Delphine wore a similar cord. Elias's heart stuttered. He stared at the beadwork. Where did you get that? He asked. Delphine blinked. From my mother, she said. Elias shook his head slowly. No, I mean the pattern, that notch. I've seen it. Delphine's face drained. You have? Elias nodded. On a boy. Years ago. I tried to save him. Delphine's breath caught. The cabin seemed to hold its own wind. Elias, she whispered again, and this time her voice carried something new. Not anger, not grief. Hope wearing a knife's edge. What? Elias asked. Delphine swallowed. His name was spoken in pieces. I heard it once, years ago, from someone who came back bleeding. Elias's pulse hammered. What was his name? Delphine hesitated. I don't know if I remember it right. Elias waited. Delphine closed her eyes and spoke carefully, each word like she was lifting it out of deep water. Elias didn't understand the sound exactly, but he recognized the cadence of a name. He'd heard it in the trader's mouth too, translated badly. Elias had forgotten the translation, but remembered the way the name had made the trader flinch. He whispered, Calder. Delphine opened her eyes wide, and tears slid down her cheeks despite her efforts to hold them back. That's it, she said. You were there. Elias's throat burned. I was there. Delphine's shoulders shook. She didn't sob loudly. She fought the sound like it was dangerous. Elias stepped closer. The tenderness in his chest nearly knocked him off balance. He reached out, then stopped before touching her. He wasn't sure if kindness could become cruelty in the space between action and consent. Delphine looked at his hand, then looked back at his eyes. Do it, she said softly. Elias brushed his fingers over the edge of her blanket, not her face. It was a small touch, more like a vow than an act. Delphine exhaled as if her ribs had been holding breath for years. I thought, she said, voice trembling, that you did it. That you chose the guns over the people. That you let your hands stay clean because you didn't want to stain them. Elias swallowed hard. My hands were there when he died, he said. I tried. Hollis, he wasn't there. He came after when the story was already made. He uses it like a club. Delphine's gaze flicked toward Hollis. Then why did you bury my name? Elias closed his eyes. The answer was ugly, not dramatic. It was cowardice mixed with necessity. I wanted the world to stop asking, he admitted. I wanted to move on. I told myself the grave was a mercy. Delphine stared at him, and her anger returned like a storm rolling in. Mercy, she repeated, tasting the word like it might be poison. Elias nodded once because there was no defense that didn't sound like self-pity. Mercy is what I called it. Delphine's voice dropped. Then the storm did what men always do. It took the truth and buried it deeper. Elias opened his eyes. And now? Delphine's lips pressed together. The question carried its own cliff edge. Outside, Hollis's voice rose again, muffled by cold and ropes. You talking with ghosts now? He spat. Delphine didn't look at him. Her attention stayed on Elias, as if her survival depended on deciding whether Elias was friend or enemy. Elias met her eyes and spoke carefully, choosing each word like it mattered. Now I'm going to make the truth harder to bury. Delphine's brow furrowed. How? Elias nodded toward the doorway. When the storm breaks, we don't just let Hollis walk away. We go after whoever told him the lie. We find the men with papers. We show them what you are. Delphine's gaze flickered with fear. Papers don't show the heart. Elias's jaw clenched. No, but they can move. A man can't run from evidence forever. Delphine studied him. And if they call you a traitor anyway? Elias swallowed. Then I'll live with it, and I'll keep choosing better after. Delphine's face softened in spite of herself. You don't know how to lie. Elias let out a quiet breath. No, I just know how to regret. Delphine's fingers reached out and finally touched his hand. Her skin was still cold but warming under the blanket. Her touch was brief and deliberate. Then let me help you carry it, she said. The cabin's heat filled the pause between them, and for a moment the survival felt like something more. Not salvation, not romantic certainty, just the raw closeness of two people who had been mistaken in different directions, now recognizing each other in the dim light. The next hours came in grim cycles. Elias kept the stove fed. He checked Delphine's stitches again and again, tightening with thread when the wound threatened to split. Delphine taught him small things, how to lay the blanket to keep heat in, how to warm water without scalding, how to speak her name without spitting it like a curse. She also watched Hollis from time to time as if reading the way he breathed. Hollis pretended to sleep, but his eyes tracked any movement. Elias fed him once, less out of mercy and more out of calculation. He needed Hollis alive enough to talk. When Delphine dozed, Elias walked to the window and stared at the storm until his eyes hurt. He imagined the trail ahead turning back into paths. He imagined town people pointing and spitting and insisting they had always known who he was. He imagined Delphine being dragged away for a story someone else had written. That fear made him mean in a way he didn't want to be. In the middle of the second day, Delphine woke with a sudden jerk, hand flying to her wound like she'd been stabbed by memory. Elias hurried over. "What is it?" Delphine's eyes were wide. "He's not alone," she said. Elias frowned. "Hollis?" Delphine shook her head. "No, behind him. Someone came while the storm hid the trail." Elias's stomach clenched. "How do you know?" Delphine's gaze turned toward the corner where the rifle rested. "I smelled metal and sweat. A man who didn't freeze like a real trapper. A man who came with purpose." Elias felt cold spread through him again because he knew what that meant. The lie had more than one mouth. Hollis groaned from the floor. "You're talking too much," he rasped. Delphine didn't bother responding. She stood slowly, careful, and crossed toward Elias. "I need to see," she said. Elias shook his head. "You can't move like this." Delphine's eyes flashed. "If we wait, we'll die." Elias grabbed her hand, pulling her gently back. "Then we'll plan, not panic." Delphine stared at his grip, then let it go. She stepped behind the hanging hides and peered through a gap at the cabin's front where wind had torn a corner seam. Elias followed, heart hammering. Outside, in the dim light of blowing snow, Elias saw a figure near the trees. A man, holding a lantern shielded from wind. The lantern glass glowed faintly, but Elias could make out boots and posture. This man wasn't trapping. He wasn't waiting for game. He was waiting for Elias to fail. Delphine whispered, "Sheriff's cousin," in a language Elias didn't fully understand, but he caught the meaning in her tone. A man with law behind his teeth. Elias's thoughts raced. They couldn't fight outside. They couldn't run in this storm. They couldn't keep hiding Delphine forever. They needed the lawman's mistake. Elias looked at Delphine and saw something in her eyes that wasn't surrender. It was strategy. "What are you thinking?" he asked. Delphine's voice was quiet. "Let him come. Let him hear the truth from your mouth before he finds his story." Elias frowned. "You think he'll believe me?" Delphine met his gaze. "I think he'll fear being wrong more than he fears being cruel." Elias didn't like it, because fear could make men do unpredictable things. But the cabin was a cage, and the storm made every decision urgent. Elias turned back to Hollis. "You said you've been watching," he told Hollis. "You didn't come alone." Hollis's mouth twisted. "I came for what was owed." Elias stepped closer and lowered his rifle slightly. "Talk." Hollis's eyes flickered toward Delphine. "She's worth money," he insisted. Elias's voice sharpened. "Who told you? Name him." Hollis hesitated, then spoke with reluctant venom. "Judge Harlan's nephew. He's doing business with traders. He said your cabin got a live one. Said you was keeping her like meat." Delphine stiffened at the mention of Harlan. Elias saw it in her body before she said anything. "What is it?" Elias asked. Delphine's jaw clenched. "That judge makes decisions in warm rooms. He signs papers like he's playing cards." Elias's anger deepened. "So we're not just fighting Hollis." Delphine nodded. "We're fighting a system built to call cruelty law." Elias felt a fierce tenderness under the rage. He didn't want to become an instrument of violence. He wanted to become proof. Proof that Delphine could survive without being owned. He looked at Delphine. "Can you stand on your own?" Delphine lifted her chin. "I can stand. I can speak." Elias exhaled. "Then speak." The night thickened into a blur. Elias kept watch through the window while Delphine readjusted her wrap and steadied herself at the stove. Hollis dozed and shifted, his bound wrists groaning when he moved. The lantern outside grew closer again. Footsteps crunched in snow, deliberate and confident. At last a knock came, too polite to be friendly. Elias stood by the door, rifle ready but not raised to strike. Delphine stood behind the hanging hides, close enough that Elias could see her expression when the door opened. Hollis stirred on the floor, watching. Elias cracked the latch. A young man stood there, lean, pale, with cold that didn't show discomfort, eyes sharp with the kind of authority that didn't have to hunt for food. He held a badge chain at his belt and a lantern in his hand. "Elias Rourke," the man said. He spoke the name like it belonged to him. "Open up! Sheriff's office wants to speak." Elias didn't answer right away. He studied the badge, the angle of the man's shoulders, the confidence that came from believing the world agreed with him. Delphine stepped forward from behind the hides, and the man's eyes widened. The lantern light caught her face and the beaded cord on her wrist. "Apache woman," the man murmured, disgust and greed mixed. "So you're the one." Delphine's voice came steady despite the weakness. "I am Delphine Tazi." The lawman looked between Elias and Delphine, calculating. "You're alive," he said like it was an inconvenience. "You shouldn't be." Elias cleared his throat. "She should be alive because she's alive." The young man's mouth tightened. "You're Elias Rourke, the trapper." "Yes," Elias answered. "And you've been harboring a fugitive," the man continued. Delphine's eyes flared with contempt. "Fugitive. I was hunted." The young man lifted his lantern, letting the light fall across her wound and the bandage Elias had replaced. "Hunted," he repeated with a laugh that wasn't humor, "by people who were paid to do their duty." Elias felt his temper rise, but he forced control. He needed the man's logic to fracture. "Duty," Elias said. "You mean contracts." The lawman's gaze sharpened. "I mean the law." Elias shook his head. "Your law don't care who's bleedin'." The lawman's face hardened. He reached into his coat. Elias lifted his rifle slightly, more a barrier than a threat. The young man hesitated, eyes flicking to the weapon. Delphine spoke again, and her voice carried a weight that turned the air heavy. "You came for me because Hollis Cr—" She stopped herself mid-sentence, then corrected with precision. "Because you came for what Hollis Crane says I am. A property. A story." The young man's jaw clenched. "Be quiet." Delphine didn't. "My people were moved. My family scattered. Men with your uncle's papers signed orders and called it rescue." Elias watched the young man's eyes. He saw it, the crack of discomfort. The system didn't like being named. It survived by keeping things vague. Elias chose his moment. He stepped forward and placed his hand on his own chest, as if offering a confession. "I was there the first time," Elias said. "I buried a name. I thought it was mercy. It wasn't. I was wrong." The young man stared. "You're confessing?" Elias nodded. "I'm telling you, you got the story wrong. I tried to save Calder. I couldn't. I didn't betray them. Men like Hollis came after the violence and made it into a ladder for themselves." The lawman's eyes darted to Hollis's bound form through the cabin opening. Hollis lifted his head slowly and met the young man's gaze with a look that said he wanted to be believed. The young man's face tightened, uncertainty rising. Delphine's voice cut through. "Ask Hollis where he got his orders. Ask him why he came with a private man, not a warrant. Ask why he smelled of iron and lantern grease instead of cabin smoke." Elias realized Delphine had guessed the lawman's purpose with the skill of someone who had been hunted by better minds than her. She wasn't just surviving, she was decoding. The lawman swallowed. "Shut up," he said again, but weaker. Elias's voice turned firm. "Look at her wound. Look at the snow. If you take her now, she'll die on your route." The lawman hesitated, then his eyes shifted to Elias's rifle again. "You'd rather she live as your captive?" Elias shook his head. "I'd rather she live as a person." Delphine stepped toward the door, stopping just inside, holding the lantern light like it couldn't burn her. "If you want to arrest someone," she said, "arrest the men who sell my blood as proof." The young man's gaze flickered, and Elias saw the moment his courage faltered. Not from kindness, but from fear of being held responsible for taking an Apache woman into a storm without cause. He glanced down at his badge chain. He looked like a man wondering whether his career was worth one mistake. Finally, he scoffed and leaned back, voice sharp to cover doubt. "I'm not leaving without her." Delphine's eyes widened slightly, and Elias saw the fear flare, not for herself, but for the choices that would come next. Elias tightened his grip on the rifle. Then the cabin door shook again. Another knock, deeper and different. A different body, a different purpose. The young lawman straightened, relieved for reasons Elias didn't understand. A second man's voice called from outside, rougher and older. "Harlan's nephew, open up. I brought the papers the right way." Elias felt his blood turn cold. Papers the right way. That meant the lie had more backup. Delphine's hand found Elias's sleeve. The touch was small, but it anchored him. Elias leaned closer to her. "Stay behind me." Delphine's eyes flashed. "No!" Elias blinked. "Delphine!" She shook her head. "I've been behind men long enough. If they want truth, they'll hear it from both of us." A heavy silence fell as the door opened a little more from the outside pressure. The storm pressed harder too, making it difficult to hear. Elias saw Delphine's wound again and realized something. If things went wrong, he couldn't carry her and fight at the same time. He needed a plan that didn't rely on strength. Delphine must have seen the same thought because she leaned close and spoke quickly. "When the older man steps inside, he'll be looking at me. He'll think I'm weak. I need you to grab the lantern and throw the light on Hollis's hands." Elias frowned. "Why?" Delphine's eyes sharpened. "Because Hollis wears iron filings on his fingers from the tool he used. It will match the pry marks on your door latch." Elias's mind clicked. Evidence. Not a declaration, not a story. Proof that this cabin had been forced. The older man finally stepped into the doorway with confidence that looked like entitlement. He held a folder of documents. His lantern light made Elias's shadow jump on the wall. The lawman's nephew started to speak, then stopped when Elias lifted a lantern toward Hollis's hands. The older man's eyes landed on Hollis's wrists and fingers, on the black residue from the tool. Elias's voice came firm. "He broke in. Not you. Not the sheriff. Hollis did." Delphine stepped forward and spoke her full name again, clearer now, stronger. "I am not property. I'm not a prize. I'm Delphine Tazii, and if you've got a warrant, it better be for the man who forced this door." The older man's face tightened. For a heartbeat, Elias saw calculation turn into discomfort. He had expected a simple capture. He had expected a woman too weak to resist, but Delphine stood on her own and spoke as if she'd built her voice by surviving. The older man glanced at the door latch, at the pry marks. Then he looked at Elias's rifle, and for the first time his posture shifted from judge to wary man. "I need to see the facts," he said. Elias nodded slowly. "Facts. Here are facts." Delphine's eyes held his. Her gaze said she trusted him now, but also that she knew trust was earned in pain, not granted in speech. The confrontation didn't end with blood. It ended with the men leaving their authority on the doorstep. The older man ordered the younger one to step back, then to recheck. His folder stayed unopened as he realized the paperwork he brought might be wrong if it was based on Hollis's lies. When they retreated into the snow, their lantern light shrinking until it was only a moving star, Elias felt his knees threaten to buckle. He didn't realize he'd been holding his breath until the cabin's air rushed back into his lungs. Delphine let out a shuddering breath, then sank into a chair near the stove. Elias knelt beside her. "You're safe," he whispered. Delphine looked at him, and her expression was raw. "Safe isn't permanent," she said. Elias nodded. Then we make it permanent the hard way. Delphine swallowed, eyes shining. What way? Elias's chest tightened. He thought of Hollis bound. He thought of the older lawman leaving. He thought of winter never truly ending. He thought of Delphine's wound and her voice, and the way her touch had felt like a question he was finally allowed to answer. We don't wait for men to decide who you are, Elias said. We decide. We go when you can walk again. We find Calder's people if they're still alive. We make a home that doesn't need permission. Delphine's lips parted as if she didn't believe the word home could be spoken in this place. Then her shoulders loosened, just a little. You're still you, she murmured. Elias's throat burned. And you're still you. Delphine stared at him as if she were learning something new about survival, learning that it could include tenderness. He reached out, and this time his hand moved to her cheek, slow enough that she could pull away if she wanted. She didn't. Her skin was warmer now, not from the stove alone, but from the fact that he didn't let her be alone with fear. Delphine closed her eyes for a moment, and Elias felt the moment stretch into something like prayer. When her eyes opened, there was a fierce tenderness there, gritty, sun-scorched in its own way, because it had been forged by winter and by lies exposed. I thought you was the man who buried me, Delphine said. Elias nodded. I was the man who couldn't find a way to fix what he broke. Delphine's voice softened. And now? Elias looked toward the front door where storm still pressed, where the world still held threats. He looked back at her wound and her strength. Now, he said, I fix what I can. I start with you. Delphine's breath caught. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his, a close contact so human it made the frontier feel less like a map and more like a place where love could happen. Elias felt the urge to promise her everything. He didn't. He promised what he could keep. I'll stay, he said, until you're safe enough to choose your own steps. Delphine's eyes glistened. Then choose, she whispered. Choose now. Elias took her hand and pulled her gently up, careful of her stitches. Her body trembled, but she stood. I choose, he said. The words weren't fireworks. They were grit and warmth, and the ache of a man who'd finally stopped hiding behind his own regrets. Delphine smiled then, small, tired, real. Elias Rourke, she said, and her voice carried his name like it belonged to her too. Hollis, still bound on the floor, made a weak sound. He tried to speak, but his mouth held only bitterness. Elias didn't look at him again. He guided Delphine back to the stove and draped a fresh blanket over her shoulders. The cabin creaked around them, storm pressed against the door, but inside there was a shift that mattered. The world might keep lying, but at least now Elias and Delphine were telling the truth to each other. Outside, winter still raged. Inside, love waited, earned in the smallest acts of staying, the hardest acts of admitting wrongdoing, and the brave act of standing together when the door could break again.